My name is Patricia Calloway. I'm 53 years old, and until 14 months ago, I was the kind of woman who believed that keeping the peace was the highest virtue a mother could possess. I kept that peace for 26 years of marriage. I kept it through dinners where my voice was talked over, through holidays where my opinions were dismissed like smoke, through every small humiliation that I told myself didn't matter because the family stayed together. And then, on a Tuesday afternoon in March of 2024, I watched a 31-year-old woman raise her hand and slap my daughter across the face. And the woman's mother-in-law, my son's mother-in-law, a woman named Gloria Harmon, laughed, actually laughed, a short, sharp sound like a bark. That was the moment the peacekeeper in me died. I want to tell you this story because I know some of you are sitting exactly where I was sitting. You've been tolerating things you should never have tolerated, making yourself small so the room feels comfortable for everyone else, and telling yourself it's love. It isn't love. I know that now. And if this story resonates with you, please take a moment to like and subscribe, and only if it genuinely moves something in you. Drop your location and your local time in the comments. I love knowing where my people are when they find me. Let me take you back to the beginning because you need to understand the full picture. You need to understand how we got to that Tuesday in March before you can understand what I did afterward. For as long as I can remember, my son Daniel was the center of my universe. That's not an excuse. It's a confession. Daniel was my firstborn, and he came into the world looking like a small, perfect answer to every question I'd ever been afraid to ask. He was bright and charming, with his father's easy smile, and I would later realize his father's easy selfishness. We'd raised him well, or I thought we had. Good schools, a strong work ethic, Sunday dinners at the table. His father, Robert, and I had built something solid for our children, a 4-bedroom house in Clarkson, Ohio, a neighborhood where people still waved from their driveways and kids rode bikes until the streetlights came on. My daughter, Leah, came 3 years after Daniel. She was quieter, more sensitive, the kind of child who brought home stray animals and cried at commercials. Where Daniel moved through the world like he owned it, Leah moved through it like she was perpetually apologizing for taking up space. I adored them both, but I'll be honest with you the way I wish someone had been honest with me. Robert always favored Daniel, not in the dramatic, theatrical way you read about, just in the 1,000 invisible ways a parent can show a child they matter more. He coached Daniel's Little League team but never came to a single one of Leah's school plays. He talked about Daniel's future like it was a blueprint already drawn. He talked about Leah's future like it was a pleasant surprise he'd wait to be informed about. I told myself it was just how fathers and sons were. I told myself Leah had me, and that was enough. It wasn't enough. I see that now. Daniel was 24 when he met Cassandra Harmon at a work event. She was beautiful in a way that announces itself immediately. Tall, polished, the kind of woman who enters a room and recalibrates it. I wanted to like her. I genuinely did. The first dinner she came to, I made my good lasagna, the one with the bechamel, and she ate 2 helpings and told me it was incredible. I thought, okay, this could work. But there were things I noticed and filed away, the way mothers do. Cassandra corrected Daniel in public, not playfully but firmly, like a teacher with a slow student. She referred to our house as cozy, in a tone that meant small. She asked what Robert did for work, and when he said he was a floor supervisor at a manufacturing plant, she said, "Oh, that's great," in a voice that said it wasn't. And her mother, Gloria Harmon, who I met 6 weeks into Daniel's relationship with Cassandra, was Cassandra amplified. Gloria was 61, twice divorced, with the confidence of a woman who'd never been held accountable for anything. She wore expensive clothes and cheaper values. She called me Patty after I'd introduced myself as Patricia, and when I gently corrected her, she winked and said, "Oh, you're funny." Daniel and Cassandra married in September of 2020. A small ceremony. COVID protocols, we were all grateful for the excuse to keep it simple. By then, I had already noticed that Cassandra and Leah didn't get along. Leah was 24 at the time, fresh out of her nursing program, working double shifts at County General. She was exhausted and proud, and she didn't have the bandwidth for Cassandra's particular brand of social performance. Cassandra found Leah difficult. Leah found Cassandra fake. I played referee, as always. The first real incident happened at Thanksgiving of 2021. Nothing physical, just words. Cassandra made a comment about Leah's apartment being in a rough part of town, and Leah said quietly that some people didn't have trust funds to cushion their choices. The table went silent. Gloria said, "Cassandra was just making an observation." Robert said nothing. Daniel looked at his plate. I said, "More gravy, anyone?" and hated myself for it. The second incident was Christmas of 2022. Cassandra had wrapped Leah's gift, a small candle set, maybe $15 worth, in a paper bag with tissue paper while everyone else had beautifully wrapped boxes. Leah didn't say a word. I saw her face when she opened it. I saw the micro-expression, the quick press of her lips, the professional composure she'd learned from years of delivering hard news at a nursing station. She smiled and said thank you. I burned with shame that I hadn't burned before. And then came March 4th, 2024, a Sunday dinner at Daniel and Cassandra's house in Whitmore Hills, a neighborhood considerably nicer than Clarkson, let me be clear, a fact that Cassandra had mentioned no fewer than 6 times over the years. Gloria was visiting. Robert was there. Leah had come straight from a 12-hour shift, still in her scrubs, her hair in a bun, looking like someone who had been awake since the previous morning. The argument started over something trivial. Cassandra made a comment about Leah's scrubs being inappropriate for a dinner table. Leah, who had not slept in 22 hours and had spent the day holding the hand of a dying 60-year-old, said she hadn't had time to change and she wasn't aware it was a formal event. Cassandra said something about common courtesy. Leah said something back. Voices rose. And then Cassandra stepped forward and slapped my daughter across the face. Open-handed, sharp, deliberate. The room went completely silent, and then Gloria Harmon laughed. "I need you to understand something before I continue. What happened in that dining room in Whitmore Hills didn't happen in a vacuum. It was the end of a very long road, and every step of that road had a signpost I chose not to read. So let me walk you down it now, because if you're going to understand why I made the call I made, you need to understand what had been built, layer by layer, for years. Let me start with the year Daniel and Cassandra got engaged. It was February 2020, and Robert and I were sitting in Daniel's apartment when he pulled out the ring, a $4,800 diamond solitaire that Robert had quietly contributed $3,000 toward. I only learned about the contribution later, when I found the bank statement folded in Robert's desk drawer. I want to be specific about that number because it matters. $3,000 from a man who, when Leah had needed $1,200 to cover her nursing school clinical fees in 2019, told her that she needed to learn to manage her finances. She'd taken out a personal loan at 14% interest. She paid it back herself over 18 months. I remember her showing me the final payment confirmation on her phone and the quiet, exhausted pride in her face. That pride cost her far more than $1,200. When Daniel and Cassandra announced their engagement, Robert and I hosted an engagement party. We spent $800 on catering, another $200 on flowers, and Robert gave a toast that made 3 women at the table cry. It was beautiful. I'm not saying it shouldn't have happened. I'm saying when Leah, 2 years later, told us she'd been promoted to charge nurse, a promotion she'd earned through years of brutal shifts and continuing education she'd paid for herself, Robert said, "That's great, honey," and went back to watching the football game. I made her a cake, a store-bought cake with congratulations written in blue icing, because I hadn't known she was coming over and it was the best I could do on 20 minutes' notice. She ate 2 slices and said it was perfect, and I think she meant it, which is almost worse. When Daniel bought his house in Whitmore Hills in 2022, Robert gave them $15,000 as a down payment gift. I know this because I signed the check. I signed it and I told myself it made sense. They were starting a family. They needed the foundation. First-time homebuyers' costs were brutal. All of that is true. But Leah had been renting a 2-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood Cassandra called rough. It wasn't rough, it was just affordable. For 4 years by then. She had never once asked us for help with rent. Not because she didn't need it, but because she'd learned early that asking our family for things was a particular kind of humiliation she preferred to skip. The gift-giving disparities aren't even the sharpest thing. The sharpest thing is the time. When Cassandra had a miscarriage in 2021, a genuine tragedy, and I want to be clear that my heart broke for her, as it would for any woman going through that loss. Robert drove to Whitmore Hills the same night he heard the news. He sat with Daniel for 3 hours. He brought bourbon and grocery bags full of food. He called twice a day for a week. He took a half day off work to attend the small ceremony they held for the baby they had named and lost. I am not criticizing any of this. I am telling you what it looked like from where Leah was standing, because in October of 2022, Leah was involved in a car accident. Not her fault. A teenager ran a red light and T-boned her on the driver's side. She was shaken, bruised, had 2 cracked ribs and a mild concussion. Her car was totaled. She was in the emergency department for 4 hours, technically the same hospital where she worked, and she called me from a hospital bed at 11 p.m. I drove to her immediately. Robert said he'd go in the morning if she needed anything. He didn't go in the morning. He called, briefly, and when Leah said she was fine, he said, "Okay, good." That was the full extent of it. No food delivery. No offer to help with the rental car costs. No half-day taken off work. Just, okay, good, and the sound of the television in the background. Cassandra, during this time, had taken to treating Leah like a tolerated inconvenience. When Leah came to family dinners, Cassandra seated her at the far end of the table, physically away from the main conversation. When Leah shared news, a difficult case at work, a milestone, a funny story, Cassandra had a habit of waiting until Leah finished and then turning to Daniel to ask him something unrelated, a move so practiced and precise it was almost impressive. Leah would trail off. She'd look down at her plate. She'd pick up her fork and take a bite and say nothing. I watched this happen at least a dozen times. I said nothing. Here's what I told myself. Cassandra was just socially dominant, and Leah needed to learn to hold her ground. I told myself it was a personality clash, not a power play. I told myself that getting involved would make things worse. I told myself that Daniel was happy, and a happy Daniel meant a stable family, and a stable family meant we hadn't failed. I was wrong about all of it, and part of me knew it. Gloria Harmon's presence at family events always accelerated the dynamic. Gloria was a woman who sorted people into useful and useless categories within minutes of meeting them, and she had long ago placed Leah in the useless column. Gloria didn't ignore Leah. That would have been easier. Gloria engaged with Leah the way a cat engages with a mouse it's not particularly hungry for. Little comments. "Oh, nursing! That must be so tiring. I could never do something so physical." Emphasis on physical. The pause before the word. The smile that said she meant something by it. And when Leah responded calmly, professionally, with the measured tone of a woman who had been explaining things to difficult people for years, Gloria would look at Cassandra and they would share a tiny smile. Private, exclusive, designed to be noticed. Robert found Gloria charming. He laughed at her jokes. He refilled her wine glass. He called her a real character on the drive home while I stared out the passenger window and tried to identify the specific shape of the thing I was feeling. The pattern was this. Daniel and Cassandra's world was the main event. Leah was the background. I had allowed it, Robert had enabled it, and Gloria and Cassandra had perfected it into something practiced and deliberate. And somewhere in the middle of all of it, Leah had quietly, without any announcement, stopped expecting anything different. That's the part that breaks my heart most when I look back. Not the slights, not the money, not the dismissals. It's that my daughter had adjusted her expectations down to match the treatment she received. She had decided this was what she was worth. Have you ever watched someone you love shrink? Not physically, spiritually. You watch them stop telling stories at dinner because the stories get dismissed. You watch them stop asking for things because asking leads to something worse than no. You watch them become fluent in smallness. That's what I watched happen to Leah over the course of 4 years, and I kept the peace while it happened, and the peace I kept was not peace at all. It was just silence dressed up in my mother's best dishes. On the morning of March 4th, 2024, Leah had texted me before she left for work. It was 5:47 a.m. The message said, "Dinner tonight still? I can come straight from shift if that's easier." And I had replied, "Of course, we love seeing you," which was true. But I hadn't said, "I'll make sure it's a safe space for you." I hadn't said, "If anyone disrespects you, I will say something." I hadn't said any of the things a mother should have been saying for years. By 7:30 that evening, I was sitting at a dining room table in Whitmore Hills, watching a woman slap my daughter across the face while another woman laughed. And the peacekeeper in me finally, permanently, put down her flag. If you've ever been the person in the room who stayed quiet when they should have spoken, if you've been the one making everyone else comfortable while someone you love gets smaller, I need you to stay with me for the rest of this story, because what came next wasn't anger, it was clarity. And clarity, when you've been without it for long enough, feels almost exactly like power. Drop your location in the comments. Tell me what time it is where you are, and tell me, have you ever watched someone you love shrink and stayed silent? I'd really like to know I'm not alone in that. Nobody moved for 3 full seconds after the slap. I counted them. Isn't that strange? In moments of shock, the brain does peculiar things. Mine started counting. 1, 2, 3. The sound of Cassandra's palm against Leah's cheek seemed to hang in the air of that dining room like a held note, and every person at that table was frozen inside it. Daniel's fork was halfway to his mouth. Robert had his wine glass raised and suspended. Gloria's laugh had faded into a wide, satisfied smile, the kind of smile that told me this wasn't entirely a surprise to her. Leah's head had turned with the impact. Her hand came up slowly, not dramatically, and touched her cheek. She didn't cry. Of course she didn't cry. This was a woman who had held the hands of strangers as they died, who had worked through a cracked rib, who had learned to shrink so well she barely occupied space anymore. She turned her head back, looked at Cassandra, and said nothing. Her eyes were very steady and very clear, and in them I saw something I recognized because I had felt it myself 1,000 times, the complete and utter exhaustion of someone who has absorbed too much for too long. I stood up. I don't remember deciding to stand. My body just did it. I was on my feet before the thought had fully formed, and when I spoke, my voice was very quiet. I've learned over the years that the quieter I speak, the more the room listens. I said, "We're leaving." Cassandra said, "Patricia, she provoked." "We're leaving," I said again. Same volume. No anger in it, just a door closing. Leah stood. She picked up her jacket from the back of her chair with the same practiced calm she used to pick up a patient's chart. She didn't look at Daniel. She didn't look at Gloria. She walked to the front door, and I followed her, and behind me I heard Robert say, "Now, let's just calm down." And I heard Gloria say something low that I chose not to process, and I heard Daniel say, "Mom, come on." But none of those voices had enough weight anymore to stop me moving toward the door. We sat in my car in Daniel's driveway for a long time without speaking. The porch light was on, and I could see shadows moving behind the frosted glass panels on either side of the front door. Leah had her hands flat on her thighs, and she was staring straight through the windshield at the neighbor's mailbox across the street. Finally, she said, "I'm okay." I said, "I know you are." She said, "You don't have to make it a thing." I said, "It's already a thing, sweetheart. It became a thing the moment she laid her hand on you." Leah turned to look at me then, and there was something in her face that I hadn't seen in years. Something young, something that was still waiting, after everything, to be told it mattered. I reached over and put my hand over hers, and I said, "I should have said something a long time ago. I am so sorry that I didn't." She didn't cry until then. And when she did, it was quiet the way she did everything, just her shoulders shaking and her breath going unsteady, and my hand on hers in the driveway of my son's $500,000 house while his porch light stayed on behind us like an indifferent eye. I drove Leah home that night. Her apartment was 22 minutes from Whitmore Hills, and I know that drive now the way I know my own kitchen, every turn, every light. Every stretch of road where the street lamps go dark for a quarter mile and it's just the two of you and the night. She told me on that drive that it wasn't the first time Cassandra had been physically aggressive. 8 months earlier, at a family barbecue, Cassandra had grabbed Leah's arm hard enough to bruise it when Leah had said something Cassandra didn't like about the guest list for an upcoming party. Leah had told no one. She'd worn a long-sleeved shirt for a week. She said she didn't tell me because she didn't want to cause problems. My daughter had a bruise on her arm for a week, and she hid it from me because she didn't want to cause problems. I went home that night and I sat at my kitchen table until 2 in the morning. Robert had come home before me and gone to bed. He had texted me once. "You should have let me handle it." I did not respond to that text. What I did instead was think. Clearly, methodically, without the fog of peacekeeping that had clouded my thinking for years. I thought about what I knew. I thought about what I had access to. And I thought about a conversation I had had 6 weeks earlier with my colleague and close friend Sandra Brewer, who had been a human resources director for 19 years before transitioning into employment law consulting. Sandra was sharp, discreet, and she owed me a favor from a situation I'll tell you about another time. Here is what I knew about Cassandra Harmon Calloway that most people at those dinner tables did not. I knew where she worked. I knew who she worked for. And I knew, because I had been paying quiet attention for 4 years the way mothers of dismissed daughters learn to do, that Cassandra's professional conduct was not as polished as her personal presentation. Cassandra was a senior account manager at Drexler and Pike, a mid-sized financial consulting firm in downtown Columbus. She managed a team of 6 people. She had been promoted twice in 3 years. Impressive on paper. But over the course of 4 years of family dinners and overheard phone calls and Cassandra's own habit of venting to Daniel loudly enough for anyone in the next room to hear, I had accumulated a specific and detailed picture of how Cassandra treated the people beneath her. The shouting, the public humiliations, the performance reviews she described with the relish of someone who enjoyed the power, the assistant she'd reduced to tears 3 times, the junior analyst she'd called genuinely stupid in a team meeting, the HR complaint she'd laughed about dismissing because she knew how to word things. That last detail had lodged in my memory like a splinter, and there was something else, something I had not mentioned to anyone. In November of 2023, I had attended a charity luncheon at the Clarkson Civic Center, the kind of event I go to twice a year, organized by the hospital auxiliary board I'd volunteered with for a decade. One of the other attendees was a woman named Renee Okafor, who I knew casually from the neighborhood. We'd ended up at the same table, and over salads, Renee had mentioned, carefully and without naming names, that a relative of hers had recently left a job due to a hostile work environment involving a supervisor. She said the relative was considering filing a formal complaint. She said the supervisor was known for this kind of thing, but had so far been protected by her relationships within the company. Renee said it with the frustrated resignation of someone who had watched an institution protect the wrong person one too many times. I hadn't connected the dots fully that afternoon, but sitting at my kitchen table at 1 in the morning on March 5th, 2024, the dots connected themselves. Renee's relative, the financial consulting firm she'd mentioned, Drexler and Pike, the supervisor described as polished, connected, and cruel to people with less power than her. I sat very still for a long time. Then I picked up my phone and I sent a text to Sandra Brewer. It was 1:17 a.m. and I knew she wouldn't see it until morning, but I needed to send it before my resolve softened. The text said, "I need your professional advice on something, not for me, for someone who deserves better. Can we talk this week?" Sandra replied at 6:42 the next morning. "Coffee Thursday, my treat." I also sent a text to Renee Okafor that same night. I said, "I've been thinking about our conversation at the luncheon. I may know something relevant. Would your relative be open to a conversation with someone who might be able to help?" I did not sleep that night. I sat in my kitchen with a notepad and I wrote down everything I remembered. Every overheard conversation. Every date I could place. Every name Cassandra had mentioned. Every complaint she'd described with that bright, satisfied laugh. I filled 4 pages of a legal notepad in my careful, even handwriting, and when I was finished, I made myself a cup of tea, and I looked at what I'd built, and I thought, this isn't revenge. This is just the truth, finally being pointed in the right direction. Robert came downstairs at 7 and found me still at the kitchen table. He looked at the notepad. He looked at my face. He said, "Patricia, don't do anything you can't take back." I said, "I've been not doing things for 20 years, Robert. Look where that got Leah." He opened his mouth and closed it again. He poured his coffee and he went into the other room. And I picked up my pen and I kept writing. Sandra Brewer has the kind of office that tells you everything about its owner before she says a word. Clean lines, no clutter, a single framed print on the wall that says "Document everything" in plain black type, which she keeps there half as a professional reminder and half, she once told me, as a joke that stopped being funny 15 years ago. She listened to me for 45 minutes on that Thursday morning without interrupting once. I put my notepad on her desk. She read through every page. When she finished, she turned the last page face down and folded her hands and looked at me with the expression of someone calibrating very carefully before they speak. She said, "How solid is your memory on the dates?" I said, "I kept a journal, not intentionally. I just write things down. I have entries going back to 2021. She leaned back in her chair. "Patricia, that is not nothing." I told her about Renee's relative. Sandra nodded slowly and said that a corroborating witness from inside the workplace was the difference between a complaint that gets filed and forgotten and one that triggers an investigation. She explained the process, the EEOC, the Ohio Civil Rights Commission, the internal HR mechanisms that Cassandra had apparently believed she'd outmaneuvered. Sandra was precise and unemotional about it, which is exactly what I needed. I didn't need outrage. I had enough of my own. I needed a map. Renee's relative, her name was Imani, she was 28. She'd worked at Drexler and Pike for 2 years before resigning in January. Agreed to speak with Sandra the following week. I was not present for that conversation, but Sandra called me afterward and said, "There are 3 other former employees. Imani knows how to reach them. This has been a pattern for at least 4 years. I want to pause here and say something important, because I know how this part of the story sounds. I know it can sound like a woman scorned, building a case out of spite. So let me be precise. I did not fabricate anything. I did not coach anyone. I did not put words in Imani's mouth or pressure Renee, or ask Sandra to do anything outside the bounds of her professional expertise. What I did was create a connection between people who had been harmed and a person who knew how to help them pursue legitimate recourse. Every word in my notepad was true. Every entry in my journal was contemporaneous and accurate. The harm that had been done to those employees was real, documented, and had been systematically ignored by an institution that found Cassandra more valuable than the people she hurt. I didn't create any of that. I just stopped looking away from it. The formal complaint was filed on April 3, 2024. Imani was the lead complainant, with 2 other former employees co-signing. Sandra consulted on the filing. I was listed as a corroborating witness with relevant observed conduct. My notepad, my journal entries, and my 4 years of dinner table observations all submitted as supporting documentation. I did not tell Robert. I did not tell Leah. I did not tell Daniel. The first consequence came on May 14, 2024, when Cassandra was placed on administrative leave pending an internal investigation by Drexler and Pike's HR department. I know the date because Daniel called me at 6:15 p.m. that evening, and his voice had a quality I hadn't heard in it since he was a teenager and had broken something he couldn't hide. He said, "Mom, something's happening with Cassandra's job." I said, "What's happening?" He said he didn't know all the details yet. I said, "I hope she's okay." And I meant that in the way you mean something that is technically true, but also entirely insufficient. What I did not say on that phone call was that I knew exactly what was happening. The investigation ran for 6 weeks. Drexler and Pike brought in an external HR consultancy. Apparently, this was not their first rodeo with internal complaints, and they'd been advised by legal counsel to establish distance. On June 28, 2024, Cassandra was terminated from her position as senior account manager. The official reason, as stated in the separation documents that Sandra heard about through professional channels, was a sustained pattern of hostile and demeaning conduct toward subordinates, conduct that had been substantiated by multiple independent accounts and supporting documentation. She was 31 years old, and she had built her entire identity on a career she'd believed was bulletproof. Now, here is where I need to tell you about the other call I made, because the job was not the only call. 2 weeks after March 4th, I had also contacted an attorney named Gregory Marsh, a family law specialist I'd been referred to by a friend whose divorce had been handled with precision and dignity. I did this not for myself. Robert and I had already begun having the conversations that would eventually become a legal separation, but that was a different matter entirely. I contacted Gregory Marsh because I wanted to understand, clearly and completely, what Leah's options were with regard to the physical assault she had experienced, and whether there were legal avenues worth pursuing. Gregory told me that a documented slap, particularly one with multiple witnesses, in a state where assault and battery laws covered unwanted physical contact, was actionable. He said the threshold for civil action was lower than most people believed. He said Leah would need to decide for herself, but that she had options. I presented those options to Leah on a Sunday afternoon in April, sitting in her apartment with takeout boxes between us and her cat, a gray tabby named Fletcher, on my lap. I laid out what Gregory had explained, cleanly and without pressure. Leah was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "I don't want to do the legal thing. I just want her to know I'm not someone she can do that to." I said, "Then let's make sure she knows that in every way available to us." Leah looked at me with an expression that was equal parts exhausted and something else, something that I slowly recognized as relief. She said, "Where were you 4 years ago?" I said, "I was being a coward. I'm sorry. I'm here now." The confrontation I had been anticipating happened in late July of 2024, when Daniel asked to meet me for lunch. Just the two of us. He chose a restaurant in Clarkson, neutral ground, a place we'd been going since he was in high school, and he arrived looking like a man who had been sleeping badly for weeks. He was thinner. The easy charm that had always lived on the surface of his face had receded and left something rawer underneath. He asked me directly, "Did you have something to do with what happened to Cassandra's job?" I looked at my son across a table I'd been sitting at since before he was born, and I made a decision about the kind of mother I was going to be for the rest of his life. I said, "I made a connection between people who had been harmed and someone who could help them pursue it through proper channels." Everything I shared was the truth. He stared at me. He said, "That's not a no." I said, "No, it isn't." The silence that followed was the longest of my life. Daniel's jaw was tight and his eyes were wet, and I watched my son process the fact that his mother had both drawn a line and admitted to crossing the one he'd expected her to stay behind. He said, "She's my wife." I said, "And Leah is my daughter. Leah, who Cassandra has put her hands on twice. Leah, who your father and I spent years treating like a footnote while we made your life the headline. That stops now, Daniel. With all of it." He didn't speak for almost 2 minutes. When he finally did, his voice was quieter. He said, "Gloria thinks you went too far." I said, "Gloria has no standing in my decisions." He said, "Cassandra's looking for new work. It's been hard." I said, "I imagine it has been." He said, "Is there any version of this where we move forward?" And I said, because it was the most honest thing I could give him, "That depends entirely on whether Cassandra is willing to formally apologize to Leah. Not a conversation, not a 'let's move on'. A real, written acknowledgement of what she did and a commitment that it will never happen again. And it depends on whether you are willing to be the husband who asks that of her, and the son who protects his sister, and the man I raised you to be." He looked at his food. He looked at me. He nodded once, slowly, and said, "I'll talk to her." I don't know what he said to Cassandra in private, but on August 19th, 2024, I received a handwritten letter. 4 pages. Cassandra's handwriting, which I recognized from Christmas cards and thank you notes. It was the most difficult letter I've ever read, not because it was bad, but because it was real. She wrote about things from her own childhood that I hadn't known. about patterns she'd carried without examining them, about the satisfaction she'd found in control that she now understood was damage wearing a nice outfit. She wrote that she was in therapy. She wrote that what she had done to Leah was wrong and that she had no defense for it. She wrote that she would not ask for forgiveness because she hadn't earned it, but that she was trying to become someone who deserved to be in this family. The letter was addressed to me, but there was a second envelope inside, sealed, addressed to Leah. I called Leah and told her it was coming. She said, "Okay." Then, after a pause, she said, "Mom?" "Thank you." I said, "Don't thank me. I'm just finally doing my job." Gloria Harmon has not been invited to a family event since March. That was not a rule I announced. It was a boundary I enacted. No dramatic decree, no confrontation, just a consistent and permanent absence of invitations. She called me once in June to tell me I was breaking up a family. I said, "I'm protecting one." She hung up. I put the kettle on and I made myself a cup of tea, and I sat at my kitchen table, and for the first time in a very long time, the kitchen felt like mine. It is February of 2025 now, 11 months since that Sunday dinner in Whitmore Hills, and I want to tell you what my life looks like today, because the ending of a story like this matters just as much as the middle. Maybe more. Anyone can survive a crisis. The real question is what you build in the quiet that comes after. Let me start with the practical things, because I've found that the practical things often carry the emotional weight better than the emotional things do. Robert and I are legally separated. We filed in September of 2024. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because Robert is not a villain. He is a man who made choices over many years that had consequences he never fully examined, and when those consequences finally became visible, he didn't know how to respond to them. The separation was not primarily about the night of March 4th. It was about a conversation Robert and I had 3 weeks after that night, when I sat across from him at our kitchen table and I said, with complete calm, "I need you to tell me that what happened to Leah was wrong." And Robert said, "It was an overreaction on everyone's part." I looked at him for a long time. I said, "A woman put her hands on our daughter and your mother-in-law cheered, and you think the problem was overreaction." He said, "You know what I mean." I said, "I do know what you mean. That's the problem." We tried 3 sessions with a marriage counselor before I understood that what I was trying to repair was something Robert didn't believe was broken. I stopped going to the sessions in August. I called Gregory Marsh the following week. The house in Clarkson is mine. We've agreed on that. Robert has moved into an apartment 12 minutes away, and we speak occasionally about the logistics of the process. And those conversations are civil and exhausted and utterly unlike the marriage we used to have, which is either a tragedy or a relief, depending on which hour of the day you ask me. I am choosing to call it a relief. The house feels different now. I repainted the kitchen in October, a warm ivory color that I'd wanted for years, and Robert had called too yellow. I bought new curtains for the living room. I rearranged the furniture in a way that makes more sense to me, that opens up the space near the front windows where the afternoon light comes in long and golden from about 3 o'clock until the sun drops. I sit in that light sometimes with Fletcher on my lap. Leah lets me borrow the cat for weekends, which is an arrangement that suits all 3 of us. And I think about what it means to finally inhabit a space on your own terms. Here's what I want to tell you about Leah first, because she's the person this story was always really about. Leah is doing well. She got a promotion in December, clinical educator, a role that takes her off the floor 3 days a week and lets her train the newer nurses, which turns out to be something she is extraordinarily good at. The promotion came with a salary increase of $14,000 annually, and the first thing she did was put $400 a month into a savings account she named, without any drama, Someday. She doesn't know exactly what someday looks like yet. She just knows it exists now, which is more than she believed 8 months ago. She read Cassandra's letter alone in her apartment on a Tuesday night, and she called me afterward and said, "It was real. I could feel that it was real." I said, "What are you going to do with it?" She said, "I'm going to think about it for a while." That's Leah. She doesn't rush her own processing, and I have enormous respect for that. She and Cassandra have not spoken directly since March. But in December, at a small dinner I hosted, just Daniel, Leah, Cassandra, and me, the first time the four of us had been in the same room since that night, Cassandra arrived with a bottle of wine and a quietness about her that I hadn't seen before. A genuine quietness, not the calculated composure she used to perform. She said hello to Leah. Leah said hello back. They sat at opposite ends of my table in my kitchen with the new ivory walls, and we had a dinner that was careful and imperfect and real in a way that none of our previous dinners had ever been. Nobody pretended everything was fine. Nobody pretended it wasn't. We just ate the food and talked about small things and let the room be what it was. When Cassandra and Daniel left that night, Cassandra stopped in the doorway and said to me quietly, "Thank you for this." I said, "Thank Leah. She's the one who showed up." Cassandra nodded. Her eyes were bright. She went out to the car, and I stood in my doorway and watched the taillights disappear down the street, and I didn't feel triumphant. I felt something quieter and more durable than triumph. I felt like a woman who had finally done the right thing at the right time, even if the right time was years overdue. Now let me tell you where everyone else landed, because you've come this far and you deserve the full picture. Cassandra is working again. She took a position at a smaller firm, a step down in title and salary from where she was at Drexler and Pike. She is in therapy, as she said in her letter, and Daniel has joined her for couples sessions twice a month. He called me in November and said something that I have been turning over in my mind ever since. He said, "I knew she could be hard on people. I told myself it wasn't my business." I said, "The people we love are always our business, Daniel. That's what love means." He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I should have protected Leah more." I said, "Yes, you should have. And you can start now." He's trying. I see it when we're all in the same room. The way he makes sure Leah's part of the conversation, the way he laughs at her stories, the way he sometimes puts his hand on her shoulder in that casual, brotherly way that tells her she matters to him. It's not enough to undo the years, but it's real, and real is where you have to start. Robert calls on Sundays. The calls are brief and logistical and occasionally verge on something warmer before retreating back to safe ground. I don't know what Robert will do with the remaining years of his life, or whether he'll ever fully understand what his passivity cost his daughter. That's not something I can give him. Insight is not a gift you can hand someone. You can only create the conditions in which they might find it themselves. I've created those conditions by being honest with him. The rest is his work to do. Gloria Harmon remains, as far as I know, exactly who she has always been. I heard through Daniel that she told people in her social circle that I was unstable and had gone after Cassandra for no reason. I heard this, and I felt nothing in particular. Gloria's version of events is constructed entirely from her own convenience, and I learned a long time ago that you cannot argue someone out of a story they need to believe. You can only refuse to be a character in it. I want to talk about forgiveness now because I know it's what some of you are waiting for. Whether I've forgiven Cassandra, whether I've forgiven Robert, whether I've forgiven myself. I'll answer the last one first because it's the most important. I have not fully forgiven myself yet. I think that's honest. I think about the years I watched Leah shrink and said nothing. The Christmases and the dinners and the car accident and the bruise I didn't know about for 8 months, and I carry that. I don't flagellate myself with it. That's not useful. But I carry it as a reminder because I think it should be carried. It keeps me honest. It keeps me present. It keeps me in my daughter's corner in a way I should have been all along. For Cassandra, I am in the early stages of something that might eventually become forgiveness. Not because she's earned it fully. Forgiveness isn't about earning, it's about releasing. But because I watched her choose to be accountable when she could have chosen defense, and that matters to me. Accountability is rarer than people think. It deserves acknowledgement even when it comes late. For Robert, I am somewhere in between. I am not angry at him. I am just clear about what he is and isn't capable of, and I am building my life accordingly. Here is what I want to say to anyone who is sitting where I was sitting a year ago. Anyone who has told themselves that keeping the peace is the same as keeping the family together. Anyone who has watched someone they love absorb mistreatment and coached themselves out of intervening because the intervention felt more frightening than the harm. The peace you're keeping is not peace. It is just harm that's been made comfortable. And comfort is not the same as safety. And safety is not the same as love. And love, real love, requires you to stand up sometimes, even when standing up costs you something. Especially then. You are not obligated to maintain silence in exchange for belonging to people who have never fully let you belong. You are not obligated to absorb or excuse cruelty directed at the people you love. You are not obligated to wait until someone is bleeding before you decide the wound is real. If you are the mother in this story, stand up earlier than I did. If you are the Leah in this story, the one who learned to shrink, who wore long sleeves, who said she was fine when she wasn't, I want you to know something. Your adjustment to the mistreatment was not weakness. It was survival. And survival is not the ceiling of what you deserve. You deserve more than survival. You deserve to be seen, consistently and completely, by the people who asked you to sit at their table. And if the people at that table won't do it, build your own. Fill it with people who show up, who tell the truth, who choose you without conditions. That table exists. I know because I'm sitting at mine right now in an ivory kitchen with good light and a borrowed cat, and it is the most peaceful room I have ever been in. Your table is waiting. All you have to do is stop saving seats for people who never intended to sit down. I didn't expect to keep thinking about this story once I'd lived through the loudest parts of it. That's what I want to talk about in this final section, the long view. The part that comes after the confrontations and the letters and the legal separations and the carefully navigated dinners. The part where the dust has settled and you're left with the ordinary shape of the life you've built from the wreckage of the one you thought you had. It's a Tuesday morning in February as I write this. I'm at my kitchen table, the same table where I sat up until 2 a.m. with a legal notepad and finally let myself be angry on my daughter's behalf. The ivory paint has held up beautifully. The winter light is doing that thing it does in February where it's thin and cold and somehow clarifying, like a lens that strips away the soft focus. Fletcher is asleep on the chair across from me, one paw extended off the edge as if he's testing whether gravity still applies. I've had 2 cups of coffee. I am, by any reasonable measure, at peace. I want to tell you what that peace cost because I think it's important to be honest about cost. Transformation always costs something, and pretending otherwise does a disservice to everyone still in the middle of their own. The first thing I lost was the version of my family that I had spent 26 years curating. That version, the Sunday dinners, the unified front, the narrative that we were a good family with normal tensions and ordinary friction, is gone. It was never entirely real, but it was real enough to live inside. And losing it involved a genuine grief that I don't think I fully anticipated. There were nights in the first few months after Robert moved out when the house was so quiet that the quiet itself felt hostile. When I walked past the dining room and saw the table set for one, and felt the specific loneliness of a woman who had organized her identity around a family unit that no longer existed in its original form, I let myself feel that grief. I didn't rush it or reframe it or remind myself that I'd made the right choices. I just sat with the loss and let it be a loss. I think that's important. You can know that something needed to end and still mourn the ending. Those 2 things coexist, and refusing to let the mourning happen is how people end up bitter instead of healed. The second thing I lost was the comfort of passivity. This is stranger to explain but equally real. When you've been a peacekeeper for 2.5 decades, passivity becomes its own kind of refuge. You don't have to take positions. You don't have to accept responsibility for outcomes. You can tell yourself that your neutrality is kindness, when really it's self-protection. I lost that story about myself. I can no longer be the woman who stays out of it, because I know now what staying out of it produces, and I cannot unknow it. That means every situation going forward requires me to actually decide, to be present in my own choices. That is considerably more exhausting than it sounds, and also considerably more alive. Now let me tell you what I gained, because this is the part that makes the cost make sense. I gained Leah. Not in the sense that I didn't have her before. She was always my daughter, always present, always loving in her quiet and careful way. But the Leah I have now is different. She calls me more. She tells me things. Last month, she called me on a Thursday night, not for any particular reason, just to tell me about a student nurse she's been mentoring who reminded her of herself at 22, and we talked for 45 minutes about what it means to teach someone that their instincts are worth trusting. That conversation, ordinary, unhurried, full of the small particular details that make up a real relationship, is not a conversation I would have had with Leah a year ago. Because a year ago, she had learned to keep herself at a careful distance from a family that had taught her, very effectively, that her presence was conditional. She is unlearning that, slowly in the way that real unlearning happens, not in dramatic reversals but in small moments of choosing differently. She mentioned last week that she told a colleague, directly and without apology, that a comment the colleague made had been unkind. A year ago, Leah would have absorbed that comment and written it off. Instead, she said something. She told me about it with a kind of quiet pride, and I said, "Good." And she said, "It felt weird." And I said, "It'll feel less weird every time." And she said, "I know." That is a whole world in 4 short sentences. I gained clarity about what I will and won't accept, which sounds like a small thing, but is actually the organizing principle of a peaceful life. I know now, with the certainty of someone who learned it the hard way, that silence in the face of cruelty is not neutrality. It is a vote. It is a signal to the person doing harm that the room is safe for their behavior, and a signal to the person being harmed that they are on their own. I will not cast that vote again, not in my family, not in my friendships, not in the peripheral moments of daily life where cruelty sometimes shows up wearing ordinary clothes. I see it now. I will name it now. That is non-negotiable. I gained a friendship with Sandra Brewer that has deepened into something I value enormously. We have lunch on the first Friday of every month. She is direct and funny, and she doesn't let me romanticize things, which is a quality I have come to treasure. She told me recently that what I did, the notepad, the journal, the connections I made, was not unusual among people who've spent years paying close attention to dynamics others ignore. She said, "The observers always have the evidence. They just usually talk themselves out of using it." I said, "I almost did." She said, "But you didn't. On a Tuesday night in March at 1 a.m, you didn't." I said, "Leah came home with me." And Sandra nodded and said, "That's usually how it works. You needed a reason big enough." I want to say something directly to anyone who has been listening this and recognizing pieces of their own story in it. If you are the mother or father who has kept a peace that was never really peace, if you have told yourself that not intervening was the same as not taking sides, and that not taking sides was the same as fairness, I want you to hear this gently and clearly. Fairness requires you to recognize the unequal distribution of harm in your family and respond to it. Neutrality in the face of that inequality is not fairness. It is a comfortable word for an uncomfortable choice. You can do better. It is not too late. And the people you love most are waiting, with more patience than they should have to have, for you to do it. If you are Leah, if you are the one who has adjusted, adapted, shrunk, hidden your bruises, worn long sleeves, said, "I'm fine," ate store-bought cake at your promotions, and told yourself it was enough, I want you to know that the version of you that knew you deserved more was right all along. You didn't internalize the mistreatment because you were weak. You survived it because you were strong. But surviving is not the same as living, and you deserve to live. Fully, loudly, taking up exactly as much space as you need. Stop apologizing for your presence. Stop making yourself smaller so other people can feel bigger. The room was always big enough for you. If you are Daniel, if you are the favored one who told yourself it wasn't your business, who looked at your plate when you should have looked up, who let the imbalance continue because correcting it would have cost you comfort, it is not too late to choose differently. You do not have to be the person the system made you. You can decide today to see the people who were overlooked and start actively compensating for the years of looking away. It won't undo the past, but it will change the future, and the future is the only place any of us actually live. I am not going to tell you this story has a perfect ending. It doesn't. Real life doesn't resolve into clarity and closure the way we want it to. Robert is still working through whatever he's working through in his apartment 12 minutes away. Daniel and Cassandra are still in the early chapters of who they're going to become. Leah is still unlearning a decade of smallness, one phone call and one honest conversation at a time. Gloria Harmon is still Gloria Harmon, which is its own form of consequence. But here is what is also true. It is a Tuesday morning in February, and I am at peace. And the peace I have now is not the performing kind, not the careful, fragile, curated kind that I maintained for 26 years at the cost of my daughter's safety and my own integrity. It is the kind that comes from having finally told the truth, acted on what you know, and built your life around what actually matters. That kind of peace is available to you too. It might require you to make the call you've been putting off. It might require you to write down what you've been witnessing and bring it somewhere it can finally be useful. It might require you to sit in your driveway and tell your daughter that you're sorry and that you're here now, even if now is late. It might require you to let a version of your life end so that a truer one can begin. Do it anyway. You will not regret the honesty. You will only regret the years you spent without it. Thank you for spending this time with me. If this story found you at the right moment, if something in it reflected something true about your own life, please like and subscribe, only if it genuinely moved you. Drop your location and your local time in the comments and tell me, have you ever been the one who kept a peace that cost someone else their safety? Or have you been the one who paid that cost? I read everything. Your stories matter to me, and I want to hear them. There are more videos in the description if this resonated. People who found their way back to themselves through truth. I'll see you in the next one. Your table is waiting. Go sit at it.